Peak! This is my idea. It's like peak oil, but it's much broader. Peak is the living conditions the oil economy produces. Peak means hot and cold running water, supermarket food, and 24/7 electricity. Peak also means the people you can educate and keep fed and watered. That's all of us. We are a tremendous technological achievement in and of ourselves. The advance of peak, the finance, engineering, and logistics, is one enormous uniform process. It makes everywhere, the world over, look and feel the same. Everywhere you are, you look around and it's all plastic, chipboard, carpet, strip lighting, glass, air conditioning, and people looking into their phones. The airport, the highway, the mall, television, the skyscraper, and the smartphone. These are all technological forms synonymous with peak. McWorld! In the 1990s, the sociologist George Ritzer recognized this phenomenon of sameness and called it McDonaldization. For Ritzer, McDonald's not only trained its employees, it trained its customers. The political theorist Benjamin Barber saw the same thing and called it McWorld. The clockwise force he called, this was long before 9/11, jihad. For Barber, there were lots of little jihads, but only one McWorld. Concrete and soy. There will be at least 2 forum questions illustrating the phenomena of peak. Both focus on the hidden processes that sustain peak living conditions in everyday life. One is about concrete and the other is about soy. They make a neat contrast. Concrete has been around for thousands of years and is associated in the post-war era with corruption and cronyism and patriarchy. You'll shake your head at the statistics about the amount of concrete they pour every year in China and Japan. Soy has also been around forever, but it wasn't until the 1950s that the Americans discovered that you could feed it to livestock. Now soy grown in Brazil and Argentina is feeding cattle and pigs in China. Global flows of money and migrants might concentrate in the metropolis, but peak is all around you all the time, wherever you are, in concrete and plasterboard, in clean water running through copper pipes, in electrical wiring and Ethernet cables. Think about red Con Ed trucks in the New York street. That's peak in action. Modernization and peak. You can think of peak living conditions spiraling outwards from the imperial core in North America and Europe in the decades after World War II. With repeated waves of innovation, peak moves down the occupational distribution at home and spreads out from the metropolis abroad. Peak enables a nation to produce an educated middle class, to move up the global supply chain and to increase its political clout. Ask the people of China or the people of Poland if peak is a good thing. However, as Carroll shows, modernization also divides populations, majorities against minorities, and especially the metropolis against the countryside. Groups organize to defend their culture and religion, and occasionally, as we will see in the case of Iran and Poland, they seize control of the political system. The Polish case is particularly illuminating. The Poles who rose up against the communists are the same Poles who are now resisting Poland's drift to the west. They didn't do all that for their grandchildren to adopt the cultural attitudes of the Germans. People want peak, but it's critical that you understand. They want it on their own terms. They want to pick and choose from what most people around the world consider to be an American menu. They didn't like MTV, they don't like YouTube, and they certainly don't want TikTok. They still want to decide who marries who and when. Nicki Minaj is not funny. Modernization is always a contested process, in every family, in every ethnicity, and in every nation. Partial peak. We are so much the creatures of its domain that we don't even realize peak is there until we go somewhere where it isn't. Somewhere where they have to walk to the well to get water, where there's no electricity, and where the nearest supermarket is 25 miles away. The number of people who can take peak for granted is still only 1 to 2 billion at most. It's sobering to think that that's probably only as many as the 1 to 2 billion who have no access to peak services at all. That means the largest number of people in the world are living with what I call partial peak. They drink bottled water, they only have electricity for a few hours a day, and they are often dependent on casual labour, so they can't always afford to shop in the supermarket. Peak and empire. Now then, we are all used to the idea that peak is a terrible thing because its machines are mining and burning up the Earth's resources at an unsustainable rate, which they are. We are also used to blaming the cruel old men who drive the machines for farming the land and its people, as they always have. All this is true, and unfortunately, it's entirely in line with the history of human civilization to date. As Harari argues in Sapiens, empire is human history's great homogenizing force. Peak is exactly what you'd expect empires to do with emerging technologies. It's what they've always done. They extend their influence by trade and through the diffusion of their techniques, in our case, finance, engineering, and logistics. The Americans got close to regulating the oil industry into decline in the mid-1980s, but then Bush was elected to follow Reagan and momentum was lost. From that point on, the industry's lobbyists have spent decades on the campaign to discredit climate science. This is exactly what you'd expect to happen in the court of a declining empire. We are the product of peak. We carry on like peak is something that is done to us when in fact we wouldn't exist without it in the first place. You and I are as much a product of peak as all the movies and television we like and all the music and sports we hate. We have all played our tiny part in shaping what it has become. Peak is what enables parents to raise well-fed and watered offspring and educate them so that they have many more choices than they had. We like to understand consumerism as a treadmill of meaningless plastic trinkets and digital gadgets, but there are still billions of people in the world who want peak for basic reasons of health and security and a purchase on a better future. Humanity's biggest problem has long been to reduce the carbon footprint of peak so that the welcome mat and promise of modernity can be extended further out. This is something the Chinese understand far better than the Americans. Peak and a pandemic. What the world desperately needed was a reason to suddenly stop and rethink the way we produce peak, and this is what we've gotten with the pandemic. An unexpected opportunity, a Great Depression and a World War II rolled into one. It wasn't like we couldn't see a pandemic coming. Civilizations always get pandemics. What we couldn't foresee coming was a reality TV performer becoming president of the most powerful nation on earth. That's the kind of thing only history could make up. Suddenly, globalization is in serious trouble. Peak is dependent on global supply chains, but flight bans and import barriers are springing up all around the world to contain the virus. It'll be a lot easier to keep these bans and barriers up than take them down again while uncertainty over the virus continues. What's the time scale? Are we talking months or years of disruptions to trade? Will we get an effective vaccine this year or next? Or will we have to learn to live with COVID like we have learned to live over the decades with AIDS? The global consensus on the virtues of free trade and human rights, already taking a battering from nationalists on the left and right, could crumble. With economies reeling over measures necessary to contain the virus, governments are going to be stretched beyond the limits of their resources. Supply chains are supposed to have built-in redundancy, but how will they hold up if entire regions have to take themselves temporarily off the grid to contain the virus? There's also plenty of scope for new wars to break out and for already dire conditions for the world's refugees to worsen. You picked the worst time to take this course since academia thought up international studies in the 1990s, but also the most interesting. Whatever comes to pass over the next few months, it is likely that the foundations of the third period of globalization are already being laid.